almost exactly a year ago, on the Feast of the Holy Cross last year, there in the sanctuary, I shared with us what I felt was the word of the Lord for our community as it was being formed. And that is that we were called to be people who recovered our song, who sang again the song of the Lord, who found a way to sing ourselves into healing. Tonight, I want to come back to that and talk about how that singing, that healing song, kind of takes shape in us, how it forms in us, and talk a bit about the sequence, the way in which healing plays out, unfolds in our life. And you'll see, I'll tell you now up front, so you can be thinking with me about it, that it begins in a kind of silence, cultivating a good silence. It moves from that to allowing your sighs to rise up from deep within you, your groans that cannot be uttered to be heard. It then shifts into bold speech, to saying what you've needed to say and not been able to say. And when you have silenced yourself and sighed and said what needs to be said, then your heart sings. And when your heart is singing, you are a healing presence. Not only a non-anxious presence, you're a healing presence. It brings life and joy and light to those who are around you. And you can live with it yourself. As I've said multiple times over the last few weeks, I still think a lot of us are waiting on God to straighten life out in front of us, to make things easier. And the good news is he will not do that. Following him does not mean life becomes simpler or easier in any way. If anything, it makes it more difficult because you have to not only bear your own burdens, but the burdens of others. And you have to feel deeply all the gone wrongness of the world, as well as the joy of the Lord. What he is going to do is enable us to live with joy, to live in ways that sing. So tonight I want to talk about the ways in which these texts we've just heard map that healing for us. The first text that I want you to notice is the Isaiah reading, the first reading from the Old Testament. And I want you to notice what Isaiah says about singing and the image he gives of a spring bursting forth in the wilderness, in the dry place. Suddenly, water bubbles forth, right? Life shows itself. It finds a way, even in that place of death and dryness. In the psalm, that song is a song of praise, a delight in the God who always sustains us and frustrates the way of the wicked. So that this song that we're meant to sing, this song that is meant to bubble up in us like a spring, is a song that celebrates the goodness and faithfulness of God and that delights in the ways that God frustrates us for good. Learning to have a sense of humor about the ways in which God stymies your foolishness. Being glad that God is patient enough and clever enough to not let you destroy your own life or me destroy my own life by being stupid. That God knows how to frustrate us for our good. Right? And this is, some of you are thinking now of St. Garth Brooks and thank God for unanswered prayers. Then in the James passage, let's turn there, because I'm going to actually turn you back to something from last week's reading that I mentioned in passing, but needs to be underscored again. So in last week's reading, at the end of chapter 1, James makes this point about pure religion, undefiled religion. He says, if any think they are religious, it's the very end of chapter 1, James 1:26. If any think they are religious and do not bridle their tongues, but deceive their hearts, their religion is worthless. Notice the connection he makes between an unbridled tongue and a deceived heart. The way in which you deceive your heart is that you talk too much and you talk too loosely. You let yourself say things you shouldn't let yourself say. And this can take any number of forms. It can look like complaining when you shouldn't complain. It can look like bragging. It can look like self-negating talk, where you are saying of yourself things that are not true, shaming yourself. It can sound braggadocious. It can sound self-deprecating. It can sound accusatory of others or of yourself. But so much of what the damage we do to our heart is by the way we talk to ourselves. And I know all of you will know what I mean when I say self-talk is a diet. What you're saying to yourself is either nourishing you or it's poisoning you. You're feeding on what you are saying to yourself. And that's either giving you life or it is not. And what we have to hear from James is this warning against the unbridled speech that deceives our hearts. And many of us, what's happening is we're living through our lives poisoning our own hearts or undernourishing them. And then when crisis comes, our heart is misdirecting us because it's disoriented and malnourished or even sick. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith but do not have works? Can faith save you? If a brother or sister is naked and lacks daily food, but one of you says to them, "Go in peace, keep warm and eat your fill," and yet you do not supply their bodily needs, what is the good of that? Faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. So here, he's pointing out the ways in which what we're saying can be disconnected from the way we actually live, what we actually do. You have to have some self-awareness about that. And then, finally, to the Gospels, to the stories in the Gospel, there are two of them. We heard the story of the woman who confronts Jesus, really, backtalks him, and finds in that backtalking the psalm. And this man who can't speak at all, or can only hardly speak. So again, what were the four kind of steps or the sequence that I said we were going to talk about tonight? What does it start with?
Silence.
Silence leads to
Sighing.
sighing, leads to
Bold speech.
bold speech, and that becomes song. Your heart sings. And what we're going to hear in these two stories are those sequences taking shape, that process working out. What begins in silence becomes the sigh, becomes the speech, becomes the song. Now, what do I mean by silence? You have to learn, first of all, we all do, have to learn to stop ourselves from saying what we shouldn't be saying. But I don't only mean that, right? I'm not just talking about, words that are out of bounds or jokes that are out of bounds. I'm talking about the ways in which, half-jokingly, we talk ourselves into despair. Here we go again. This always happens to me. It's never going to be okay. Why am I like this? Those ways of speaking are not harmless. They deceive our hearts, they dispirit us, and they will lock us in to a mood, a way of living that, because it's dispirited, becomes desensitized to the goodness that's actually taking shape in our life. I talked about this last week, remember, that God's goodness is coming to us, but we're talking to our shadow, or our shadow is talking to us. And so we can't meet the face of God because we're turned in on ourselves. We're turned in on ourselves, and we're either telling ourselves what we wish were true and is not, or we're telling ourselves what we're afraid is true but is not. Either way, you're not meeting the goodness that's coming to you. And so much of that, for me and for you, is about how we talk to ourselves. So the first thing the Spirit has to do is quiet us down, to teach us the kind of silence that stops our mouths running, that stops loose speaking. But the goal is not to be quiet. The goal is not simply to be silent and to not say anything. The goal in that silence is to let a sigh come up, to let the deep groans. You remember Paul in Romans talks about the groans that are too deep for words? This is a theme that shows up in the Psalms over and over again. Psalm 22, Psalm 38. That groans are a form of speaking that are deeper. They're too deep for our words. They're too heavy for words to bear. And so the groan has its own eloquence. The groan has its own power of communication. And so does the sigh. Now, with that in mind, I want to come to these stories, and I want you to see what happens. We're going to read these stories in reverse. So Jesus returns from the region of Tyre by way of Sidon toward the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. He's just letting us know that Jesus is out there. Jesus is way out there. And out there, kind of at the borders, they bring to him a deaf man who has an impediment in his speech. So I want you to think about the ways in which speech can be impeded. You're not able to say what you really need to say. And there are all kinds of images for this. You might think we talk about being tongue-tied. We talk about having a lump in our throat. We talk about choking on our words. We talk about being muzzled. And all of these ways of talking about our not being able to talk witness to this, that many of us, many times in our life, find we can't say what we need to say. And I want you to kind of set that in contrast with, in the best moments of your life, you realize you can't say what you need to say. I can't thank you enough. Right? In moments of great joy, you might laugh, you might cry, but you're carried beyond words. And in moments of great sorrow, you're carried deeper than words. In moments of great strangeness or weirdness, you're speechless. Right? So in the most intense moments of your life, words aren't enough. They can't reach the heights or the breadths or the depths of experience. This is one of the reasons that the gift of the Spirit is tied to speaking in tongues, because the Spirit is still able to work with us beyond the heights and depths and breadths of our experience, our language. Our experience extends beyond our language, and the Spirit goes with us to those places. But this particular man is not able to speak cleanly or clearly. He is tongue-tied. We don't know exactly what he's suffering from. It's not that he can't speak at all. It's that there's an impediment in his speech. He can't speak fluidly. His speech is difficult. This has been one of the kind of consequences of the stroke for me. When I get really stressed or really tired, my speech becomes choppy. I can't think clearly and I can't speak fluidly, which is, of course, a great frustration for me. But that experience for any of us, I think, is a great frustration. And the question is, what is God doing inside of that frustration? How is that frustration telling me something I need to know about the way in which grace is bringing healing to my life? So this man is struggling to speak, and they bring the man to Jesus. Now, one thing that's striking about this is that they bring him to Jesus. He does not come on his own, which tells me that perhaps he's despaired of finding that fluidity. He's kind of given up hope on being able to say cleanly and clearly what he wants to say. But thankfully, he has people in his life who get him there anyway, right? Who bring him to Jesus. So they bring him to Jesus. And Mark tells us first that the problem is with his hearing. That the reason he can't say what he needs to say is that he can't really hear what's being said. And this is another reason we need the silence. Some of us are talking so much we can't hear what's being said to us. So we're saying things we shouldn't say, can't say the things we need to say, because we're not listening to the things that are being said to us that would actually free us. We're talking too much. Even in prayer, we can talk too much. There's a story, I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, but I heard it attributed to Mother Teresa. Once in an interview, she was asked about prayer. You know where I'm going with this, Deacon Rob. And the interviewer is asking her, do you pray? Yes, of course. Do you talk to God? Do you tell him what you think? Yes, of course. And what does he say back to you? She said, well, he listens. He listens. That is what he says to me. That is how he talks to me, is he listens. That ministry of the ear that God offers us, right? We have to learn to embody. We have to learn to listen. And so much of the anxiety in our lives, I think, comes from not being able to just settle down and listen to what's being said. Like, we can always assume that God is saying what we need to hear. The question is always, can I hear what's being said? Not has God spoken, is God speaking? God is always saying exactly what you need to hear. The question is, can I hear it? Will I hear it? Will I listen? Can I quiet myself down enough to hear what's being said? So he takes this man, they beg Jesus to lay hands on this man. He takes him aside in private, away from the crowd, puts his fingers into his ears, spits and touches his tongue. This is strange. This is very, very strange. Right? It's Jesus, and probably why Jesus took him aside. Right? He takes him aside, puts his fingers in his ears, right? Looking up into heaven, he sighed, Jesus sighs, and says to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. So here, his ears have to open, but so does his throat. So does his heart. So do his eyes. His life has to open up. He's closed down. This is why he had to be brought to Jesus. And he's closed down. Who knows what has hurt him, but he's closed down to protect himself. He's closed down to keep himself from further harm, to keep from losing himself further. But notice, what does Jesus do to loose him? He groans, he sighs. And the sigh of Jesus releases this man's spirit. The sigh of Jesus over you and over me is what frees us. Now, come back to the first story. From there, he set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there. Yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. The woman was a Gentile, Syrophoenician. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. But she answered him, Sir, or Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Then he said to her, and I want you to notice how Mark articulates this story. For saying that, you may go. You're freed. The demon has left your daughter. So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. Now, what's happening here? What is this woman found? Boldness of speech. Now, there are all kinds of nonsense said about this story, because when we hear it, something about us, it's hard for us to take. And we immediately jump to worrying that Jesus has offended this woman. Even though the story is very plain, he has saved this woman. He's done exactly for her what she asked to be done. So what would it look like to assume Jesus knows what he's doing with this woman? What if Jesus is not insulting her? What if Jesus knows that her healing and the healing of her daughter is tied to an image she's internalized? I mean, Mark is very clear. Jesus is in Gentile territory. And this woman is a Gentile. And what's the image that Jesus uses? What's the image that Jesus uses when he talks to her? He says, let the children eat first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. Now, what do we know? If you've had even an introductory Bible course, what do we know about that slur? It's a slur for Gentiles. This woman has at some level internalized the denigration. She has internalized that she is unclean. What is eating up her family? What's devouring her daughter at home? An unclean spirit. And the desperation in her life is rooted in having internalized this accusation of uncleanness. Your daughter is this way because you are this way. What she's suffering is your fault because this is what you really are. And when Jesus says this, he's not doubling down on the insult. He's raising for her to reconsider the image that has dominated her self-consciousness. And how does she respond? Fine, I may be, but I'm going to eat the crumbs that fall off the table. And suddenly, the groan that drew her there to beg him, because she was so desperate for her daughter to be healed, becomes bold speech. Becomes bold speech. And I want you to notice how Jesus creates the space for this to happen by seeking out silence. Jesus secrets himself away so this woman can find him. And when she finds him, her groan becomes a speech that's bold enough to say what she really needs to say, even though she's afraid to risk it before this moment. And this is an essential stage on the road to freedom. You have to be able to say the thing that wants to be said, even if it's risky. You have to be able to say it to God. You have to be able to say it to the people you love. There are things in your heart. That lump that's caught in your throat is something you need to say, you don't want to say, because you're afraid of the consequences of saying it. And what you need is the groan of God to become stronger than the fear that's muzzling you. Because when you let the groan energize the speech, when you allow your sigh to open you up enough for what needs to be said, then the freedom comes. Then the openness comes. Then the song comes. I think, again, back to what I said a year ago, almost exactly to this day. Human beings are meant to sing, to be healing presences. Life is not easy, but we are meant to live through all of those difficulties in ways that are joyful. Not glad about everything that happens, not happy with everything that's going on, but genuinely joyful. But to get to that place of sustained joy, where our hearts are dilated with joy, where our hearts are opened wide with joy, and a song is in our mouth, we have to, first of all, silence all the noise. In that silence, let the groan of God, the groan of the Spirit, come up in us. Say what we really need to say, whether that's in prayer, whether that's to the people we love, whether that's to ourselves, whoever needs to hear it. We need to say what's wanting to be said. Because until we do that, the song can't come. We can't really live singing. So I'm going to ask you, if you will, just close your eyes, and right where you're sitting, if you'll put your hand on your stomach. Don't worry, I'm not going to come put my fingers in your ears or put your hands on your ears. But I do want you to try to mimic that silencing. Be opened. Be opened. There is something in your deep heart that wants to be said. So what we're going to do is sit here just for a moment in silence, and then I'm going to pray. And then we're going to stay in that silence for a moment. Then Deacon Rob will come, and we'll enter into the rest of the liturgy. But I don't want us to leave this moment until you commit yourself to the silence in which that groan can start to take shape. So that when you leave tonight, you can move toward that. So let's sit for a moment in this quiet, and then I'll pray. Jesus, you know our hearts better than we know them. And you know how hard it is for our hearts not to become hard. You know how hard it is for us to say what we mean. And I know many of us, if not every one of us in this room, have so much we need to say and cannot find a way to say it. We can't say it to you. We can't say it to one another. We can't say it to ourselves. We're afraid to say it. And I know that your work in our lives is to make that saying possible. So my prayer for me and for everyone else is that in the coming days, you will help us find the place of silence, not just once, but over and over and over again. And that when we seek it out, when we seek out the quiet, we quiet ourselves, that we will let you groan in us. And let that groan, your groan, the groan of your spirit, open us up to bold speech, angry speech, grieving speech, doubting speech. Whatever we need to say, God, let us know that we can and need to say it to you. That these unsaid things are wounds, infected wounds that you want to open up so the infection can be cleansed. You're not afraid of it. We don't need to be afraid of it. We need to say it. We need to be opened. Help us to say what we need to say. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen.